A crying bobcat limps out of the woods, pleading for help from a man frozen in disbelief. At first, he hesitates, but when he follows her, what he discovers hidden deep in the forest leaves him pale with shock. Injured cubs caught in a deadly snare, a silent cry for justice, and a sinister plot threatening the very heart of nature itself. Why did this wild animal trust him? And what dark secrets are waiting in the shadows? This unforgettable story will leave you breathless, questioning the power of compassion and courage in the face of danger. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning mist swirled around Daniel Carter's boots as he adjusted his camera settings, his practiced fingers moving deftly across the familiar dials. Golden sunlight filtered through the towering pines, creating perfect shooting conditions that made his photographer's heart skip with excitement. He breathed in deeply, savoring the crisp forest air and peaceful silence that had drawn him to wildlife photography in the first place. Through his viewfinder, he framed a patch of wildflowers glazed with dew, their delicate petals glistening like tiny jewels in the early morning light. His finger hovered over the shutter button when an unusual sound broke his concentration. Soft whines and cries echoed through the clearing, unlike anything he'd heard before in his years of wildlife photography, sending a shiver down his spine. Daniel lowered his camera slowly, his heart beating faster as he scanned the tree line, years of experience making him instantly alert. The undergrowth rustled, and his breath caught in his throat as a bobcat emerged, moving with visible difficulty. Its normally graceful gait was replaced by a pronounced limp, and Daniel could see blood matting the fur on its right front paw, the red startlingly bright against its tawny coat. "Oh no," he whispered, keeping perfectly still as his training had taught him. The injured creature stumbled into the clearing, its sides heaving with labored breaths that sent small puffs of vapor into the cool morning air. The bobcat stopped about 20 feet away from him. Instead of the usual wariness wild animals showed around humans, it remained in place, trembling slightly, its muscles tense beneath its spotted fur. Daniel's fingers tightened around his camera as the animal's golden eyes met his. There was something in that gaze that made his skin prickle, not with fear, but with a strange sense of connection that defied explanation. The bobcat's eyes held an almost human-like intelligence, filled with what Daniel could only describe as desperate pleading. He'd photographed countless wild animals in their natural habitats, but he'd never seen anything like this. The creature's pain was evident, but there was something more urgent in its behavior, a purposefulness that seemed almost impossible. "Hey there," Daniel said softly, fighting his instinct to approach and help. Despite his concern, he knew better than to make sudden moves around a wild animal, especially an injured one that might lash out in fear or pain. The bobcat's ears twitched at his voice, the movement quick and deliberate. Then, to Daniel's amazement, it turned and limped toward the dense undergrowth at the forest's edge, each step clearly causing it discomfort. After a few steps, it stopped and looked back at him, its gaze unmistakably expectant, as if it were waiting for him to understand. Daniel hesitated, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Everything he knew about wildlife safety told him to stay put, to let nature take its course. But something about this felt different, almost supernatural in its strangeness. The bobcat waited, its golden eyes fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to transcend the usual barriers between human and wild animal, calling to something deep within him. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself, but his feet were already moving, drawn forward by an inexplicable pull. The bobcat's behavior defied everything he knew about these solitary, cautious creatures of the forest. As he took a tentative step forward, the animal limped further into the undergrowth, pausing again to ensure he followed, its actions deliberate and measured. Fighting against his better judgment and years of ingrained caution, Daniel moved deeper into the forest, following the injured bobcat as it led him away from the sun-drenched clearing and into the shadowy thickness of the forest undergrowth, where branches reached out like beckoning fingers and mystery seemed to hang in the air like morning mist. Following the bobcat deeper into the forest, Daniel's heart thumped against his ribs like a steady drumbeat. The morning mist clung to his clothes, damp and cool, as he carefully picked his way through the undergrowth. Broken twigs snapped beneath his feet, each crack echoing like a tiny explosion in the quiet woods. He noticed strange markings on the forest floor, trampled ferns and scattered leaves that didn't look like the work of any animal he knew. The bobcat moved slowly, her usual grace marred by her injured paw. Every few steps she turned her head, golden eyes checking to make sure Daniel was still behind her. Those eyes held a mix of pain and purpose that made Daniel's throat tight with emotion. She was trusting him, and that trust weighed heavily on his heart. "I'm here," he whispered softly, his voice barely disturbing the silence. "I'm following you." The trail led them to a shadowy grove where the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead like clasped hands. Daniel's photographer's eye caught details that seemed out of place: deep scratches in the bark of a nearby oak, crushed vegetation forming an unnatural path, and scattered debris that spoke of recent disturbance. His stomach churned with unease. Something wasn't right. The bobcat stopped near a massive fallen log. Its rotting trunk created a natural shelter underneath, hidden and safe. She made a low sound, not quite a growl, but more urgent than a purr. Daniel crept closer, his boots crunching softly on dead leaves. He knelt down, peering into the darkness under the log. What he saw made his blood run cold. Beneath the log, two small bobcat cubs huddled together. One was pressed against the back of the hollow, trembling but unharmed. Its eyes were wide with fear. The other lay on its side, its leg caught in a cruel wire snare. The metal bit into the cub's flesh, leaving a ring of blood on its fur. The sight turned Daniel's stomach. "Oh no," he breathed. His hands clenched into fists as he recognized the deliberate placement of the trap. This wasn't some accident. Someone had specifically targeted this spot, knowing it might be a den site. The realization sent a wave of anger through him. The mother bobcat paced nearby, her eyes never leaving Daniel as he slowly knelt beside the hollow. The trapped cub let out a pitiful whine that made Daniel's chest ache. Its cry was a plea, a call for help that Daniel couldn't ignore. "It's okay," he murmured, more to steady himself than comfort the animals. "I'm going to help." With shaking hands, Daniel shrugged off his jacket. He wrapped the sleeve around his hand, creating a buffer between his skin and the sharp wire. The mother bobcat growled softly, but didn't interfere as he leaned closer to her cub. Her trust in him was a heavy responsibility, one he didn't take lightly. The wire was tight, cutting into the cub's leg. Daniel worked carefully, his fingers gentle as he tried to loosen the snare. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The cub whimpered, but seemed to sense his intentions, staying remarkably still as Daniel manipulated the wire. Each tiny movement was a struggle, a test of his patience and determination. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the snare finally gave way. The cub immediately scrambled deeper into the hollow, pressing against its sibling. Daniel sat back on his heels, heart racing as he watched the mother bobcat approach her cubs. She nuzzled them both, checking them over while keeping one eye on Daniel. Her gaze was a silent thank you, acknowledgement of the bond they now shared. The trust she'd shown him, leading him here, allowing him to help, left Daniel breathless with wonder and responsibility. But beneath that amazement, anger simmered. Someone had deliberately set this trap, and they likely had more scattered throughout the forest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Daniel's hands trembled as he tore a strip from his shirt, the fabric ripping with a soft sound that echoed in the quiet hollow. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked, the late afternoon sun filtering through the leaves above. The injured cub whimpered as he carefully wrapped the makeshift bandage around its small leg, its fur matted with dirt and traces of blood. "Easy there, little one," he whispered, his touch gentle but firm. "Almost done." The mother bobcat watched intently from 3 feet away, her golden eyes never leaving her cub. Her tail twitched with nervous energy, but she held her ground, seeming to understand his intentions. When Daniel finished, she padded forward and nuzzled the injured youngster, her rough tongue cleaning its fur with motherly care. With careful movements, she guided both cubs toward a darker, more sheltered spot beneath the twisted roots of an ancient oak. Standing up, Daniel stretched his stiff muscles and surveyed the clearing, his back protesting after being hunched over for so long. Something about the ground caught his eye. Metal glint dully through dead leaves and pine needles. Stepping closer, he brushed aside the debris with his boot, revealing a rusted stake driven deep into the earth. His stomach turned as he spotted another and another, forming a deliberate pattern through the undergrowth. "This wasn't random," he muttered, anger building in his chest like a slow-burning fire. Scattered around the stakes were boot prints pressed into the soft soil, some old, some fresh, telling a story of repeated visits. Whoever set these traps had been here multiple times. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they'd been at it for weeks, maybe months. Daniel pulled out his camera with trembling fingers, adjusting the settings to capture the evidence in the fading light. The stakes, the prints, the disturbed earth, each photo told part of a darker story that made his blood run cold. His hands shook, but this time with rage rather than fear. These weren't just isolated traps. This was organized poaching, methodical and cruel. The bobcat shepherded her cubs deeper into the shadows, their forms melting into the darkness of the dense forest. Her movements were quick but careful, mindful of her injured young. Daniel knelt to photograph the wire snare he'd removed, carefully documenting its cruel design and the way it had been carefully concealed beneath leaves. A sharp crack split the air, a branch breaking somewhere in the forest behind him. Daniel froze, his fingers still on the camera's shutter button, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound had been too heavy, too deliberate to be a small animal. Someone else was out there, watching from the growing shadows of the forest. Daniel hurried along the worn forest trail, his camera bouncing against his chest with each step. His mind raced with images of the injured bobcat family, their vulnerable forms haunting his thoughts. A wooden sign, its paint peeling from years of sun and rain, pointed toward Forest Ranger Station, 104 Mile. The weathered arrows beneath it marked other trails he'd explored on calmer days. The morning sun filtered through the trees as he quickened his pace, casting dappled shadows that danced across the path ahead. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he barely noticed. His boots crunched on fallen pine needles as the packed dirt path curved ahead, revealing a small log building nestled among towering pines. A thin wisp of smoke rose from its stone chimney. As Daniel approached the wooden steps of the outpost, their boards creaking under his weight, the screen door squeaked open. A ranger emerged, her uniform crisp despite the heat, badge glinting in the morning light. Her dark eyes narrowed as she watched him climb the steps, one hand resting naturally near her utility belt. Can I help you?" Her voice was firm, professional, carrying the authority of someone used to dealing with all kinds of visitors. Daniel caught his breath, his lungs burning from the quick hike. "I'm Daniel Carter. I'm a wildlife photographer, and I just found something serious in the forest. Snares, injured animals. There's a bobcat family in danger." His words tumbled out in an urgent rush. Ranger Sofia Martinez crossed her arms, her stance widening slightly. "You found snares? And how exactly did you come across these traps, Mr. Carter?" Her tone carried years of practiced skepticism. "I was taking photos this morning when—" Daniel started, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Convenient timing," she cut in, her eyes scanning his face. "You know, poachers often scout locations by claiming to be photographers." Daniel's chest tightened, his heart pounding harder. "No, you don't understand. I would never—" "Step inside," Sophia said, holding the door open. "Let's talk about what you saw." The screen door's springs squealed in protest. The interior of the station was small but organized, smelling of coffee and pine. Maps covered one wall, their corners curling slightly, and gear hung neatly on hooks beside a cluttered desk. Daniel pulled his camera from his neck with shaking hands, fumbling slightly with the power button. "Here," he said, turning on the display. "These are the photos I took this morning. There's the snare site, and here's where I found other stake holes." His finger traced the screen as he flipped through the images. Sophia leaned in, studying each image with intense focus. Her expression softened as she flipped through shots of local wildlife: deer at dawn, birds in flight, peaceful forest scenes. The morning light streaming through the station's windows illuminated the dust motes dancing between them. "These are beautiful," she admitted, her professional mask cracking slightly. "And unfortunately, those are definitely illegal snares." She straightened up, already reaching for her jacket. "I should check this out right away. I'll come with you to the site." Daniel felt relief wash over him, his shoulders dropping from their tense position. "Thank you. The bobcat and her cubs, they need help." "Show me where," Sophia said, reaching for her gear, checking her radio with practiced efficiency. "We don't have much time to waste." Daniel and Sophia walked briskly along the forest trail, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. The morning light streamed through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on their path. A cool breeze rustled through the branches, carrying the sweet scent of pine needles and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker's rhythmic tapping echoed through the trees. "The snares were right by that fallen oak," Daniel said, pointing ahead. "Professional looking, thin wire, carefully placed, the kind that would slice right through flesh." His voice caught slightly on the last words, remembering how close the bobcat had come to disaster. Sophia's face darkened. "Sounds like Marcus Tully's work. He's been a thorn in our side for years." She adjusted her ranger hat, scanning the trees with practiced vigilance. "Smart and ruthless, always one step ahead of us. We've come close to catching him before, but he always slips away like smoke through fingers." Daniel's stomach tightened, a knot of anxiety forming. "How dangerous is he?" "Let's just say nobody crosses Tully twice," Sophia replied grimly, her fingers brushing unconsciously against her badge. "He knows these woods better than most, and he's not afraid to threaten anyone who gets in his way. Last year, a hiker who reported suspicious activity found his car vandalized the next day. All 4 tires slashed, and a dead rabbit on the hood. But of course, we could never prove it was him." They reached the hollow where Daniel had found the cubs. The space felt empty now, with only scattered leaves and disturbed earth marking where the drama had unfolded. Daniel's eyes searched for the bobcat family, but they were gone. The silence felt heavy, almost expectant. A few tufts of fur caught on nearby brambles testified to their recent presence. Sophia crouched by the remnants of the snare, her trained eyes studying every detail. She pulled out her phone and took several photos, muttering under her breath. This is definitely his signature work. See how clean these cuts are? How precisely it's positioned. He takes pride in his traps, the sick bastard. Each one is like an artwork to him. Looking up at Daniel, her expression softened. I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have doubted you earlier. We get a lot of false reports, but this... She gestured at the scene, her hand trembling slightly with suppressed anger. This is exactly what we've been trying to catch him doing. They followed a narrow path deeper into the woods, where the trees grew closer together and the air felt thick with tension. Every snapping twig made Daniel flinch. Shadows seemed to dance at the corners of his vision, playing tricks with his mind. The cheerful morning bird song had faded to an uneasy quiet. Tully's clever, Sophia explained, her voice low and careful, ducking under a low-hanging branch. He sets his traps in patterns, usually 5 or 6 spots forming a rough circle. This is probably just one point in his network. He thinks like a predator, always planning 3 steps ahead. Makes it harder to catch him in the act. Daniel's hands clenched involuntarily. What can we do? For now, we document everything, build a solid case. Sophia checked her watch, the metal glinting in a stray beam of sunlight. I'll need to report this and start organizing patrols. And you... She fixed him with a serious look, her eyes conveying more than words could. Be careful. Keep your camera ready, but watch your back. Tully has eyes everywhere in these woods, and he's not above making examples of people who interfere. They agreed to meet again the next day, each taking different paths out of the woods. As Daniel watched Sophia disappear among the trees, the weight of what they were undertaking settled heavily on his shoulders. The forest suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a battlefield, with danger lurking behind every trunk and shadow. The crunch of leaves beneath his feet seemed louder now, more conspicuous, as if announcing his presence to unseen watchers. The ranger station's windows glowed with late afternoon sun as Sophia grabbed her radio, the golden light casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Daniel watched her pace, her boots clicking against the wooden floor, each step betraying her growing frustration. Base, this is Martinez. We've got confirmed poaching activity in Sector 7. Requesting backup. The radio crackled with static before a tired voice responded, the interference making the message barely audible. Copy that, Martinez. All units are tied up with the forest fire response 2 counties over. Earliest assistance would be tomorrow morning. Stay safe out there. Sophia's shoulders slumped and she set the radio down with more force than necessary. She turned to Daniel, concern etched on her face. You should get some rest. I'll organize a patrol route, but we need to be smart about this. Tully's not someone to mess with lightly. He knows these woods better than most. Daniel nodded, exhausted from the morning's events, his muscles aching from hours of hiking. He drove into town, finding a small cafe tucked between a hardware store and a post office. The weathered sign above the door read Mary's Place in faded letters. The bell chimed as he entered, and the smell of coffee and fresh-baked cookies wrapped around him like a warm blanket. He ordered a black coffee and settled into a window seat, the worn cushion sagging beneath him. Pulling out his phone, Daniel stared at an old photo, his throat tightening with emotion. It showed him and his sister Jane at their parents' lake house, both smiling, arms around each other, the summer sun making their faces glow. His thumb hovered over the screen before he typed, "Jane, we need to talk. It's urgent, please." He hit send, his stomach tight with anxiety, wondering if she'd even read it. The rumble of a diesel engine drew his attention outside. the deep sound cutting through his thoughts. A black pickup truck, caked with mud and loaded with rope and tools, pulled into the lot. The vehicle had seen better days, its bumper dented and rust creeping along the wheel wells. Daniel's coffee grew cold as he watched the vehicle, something about it setting off alarm bells in his mind. Moving carefully, he stepped outside and pretended to check his phone while snapping photos of the truck and its license plate. The door creaked open with a metallic groan, and a large man emerged. Marcus Tully stood there, his weathered face hard as stone, eyes locked onto Daniel with predatory intensity. His camouflage jacket was stained with what looked like fresh mud. Time seemed to freeze as they stared at each other, the afternoon air heavy with tension. Then Tully's lips curved into a knowing smirk, a cold expression that made Daniel's skin crawl. He climbed back into his truck, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving the smell of burning rubber in his wake and a cloud of exhaust hanging in the air. Daniel's hands shook as he looked at the photos he'd taken, knowing he'd just met the man responsible for the injured Bobcats, and likely much more. His heart pounded against his ribs as he realized there was no turning back now. In his motel room, Daniel sat at a small desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating his tired face. His camera connected to the computer with a soft click as he began uploading the day's photos. Images filled the screen. The cruel metal snares, trampled vegetation, and finally, Tully's mud-splattered truck. Each photo made his stomach twist with a mix of anger and determination. His finger hovered over the send button in his email to the local sheriff's office. Something held him back. Stories floated around town about Tully's connections, how evidence had mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. The weight of these rumors pressed down on his shoulders. Daniel rubbed his eyes and glanced at his phone. The message to Jane still showed no response, just a single checkmark indicating it had been delivered. The silence from his sister felt heavier with each passing hour. "Come on, Jane," he whispered, tapping the phone against his knee. "Not now. Not when I need you." His voice caught slightly on the words, memories of their childhood together flashing through his mind. Across town, Ranger Sofia Martinez's cabin looked like a war room. Maps covered her kitchen table, sticky notes marking possible trap locations. Coffee cups dotted the workspace like forgotten soldiers. Case files spread across her counter told a frustrating story. Years of close calls and near misses with Tully. Each failure had only strengthened her resolve. She picked up an old report, coffee ring staining its corner. 3 years ago, she muttered, we almost had him. Her fingers traced the photo of another injured animal, another victim of Tully's cruelty. The image brought back the helpless anger she'd felt that day. Sophia grabbed her phone, dialing a familiar number. "Hey, Jim, it's Martinez. I know you're stretched thin, but I've got solid evidence on Tully this time. Real evidence. Call me back when you can." She set the phone down, knowing the response might not come for days. The waiting game was one she knew all too well. The moon rose high over the forest, casting silver light through the trees. Near Daniel's motel, a shadow moved in the darkness. The Bobcat emerged, her injured paw causing a slight hitch in her step. She moved with quiet grace, positioning herself where she could see Daniel's window. The night air carried the scent of pine and distant rain. Her golden eyes reflected the dim light as she watched, unmoving. Despite her wild nature, something about Daniel had earned her trust. Perhaps it was the gentle way he moved through her territory, or how his camera clicks never startled her cubs. She settled into the grass, her ears alert to every sound, a silent guardian in the night. The mother cat's presence seemed to bridge the gap between the wild forest and the human world. her quiet vigilance a reminder of what Daniel was fighting to protect. The connection between them, though unlikely, grew stronger with each passing night. The morning sun cast long shadows across the motel parking lot as Daniel stepped out of his room, camera bag slung over his shoulder. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the nearby forest. Something white caught his eye, a piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. His stomach tightened as he pulled it free, the paper crinkling beneath his trembling fingers. The handwriting was rough, almost violent in its jagged strokes, the message brief but clear. "Stay out of the woods, stranger." Daniel's hands trembled, a mix of fear and anger coursing through him. Tully had been watching him, probably sizing him up from the shadows while he went about his daily routine. Back in his room, Daniel paced the worn carpet, his camera gear and laptop scattered across the small desk like abandoned soldiers. The morning light filtering through the thin curtains cast everything in a pale, uncertain glow. He picked up his phone, dialing Jane's number for what felt like the 100th time. "Jane, it's me again," he said when her voicemail picked up. His voice softened, the anger from moments ago replaced by a familiar ache that seemed to live permanently in his chest. "Look, I know we haven't talked in ages, but something's happening here. It might involve Mom and Dad's old property near the forest." He paused, running a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of unspoken words between them. "I could really use your insight on this. Please call me back." The silence after hanging up felt heavier than before, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. Daniel stared at the phone, willing it to ring, but it remained stubbornly quiet, the screen dark and lifeless. At the ranger outpost, Sophia was already geared up when Daniel arrived, her uniform neat and ready for action. Maps covered her desk like a paper tablecloth, and she looked up with purpose in her eyes, her expression determined and focused. "Got a tip," she said, marking a spot on one of the maps with a red marker. "Someone saw Tully's truck parked near Carson Canyon early this morning. It's the old blue pickup with the dented fender. If we move now, we might catch him setting up new traps." Daniel nodded, his resolve strengthening despite the threatening note in his pocket. The morning's fear was giving way to determination. "When do we leave?" "Give me 10 minutes to grab my gear," Sophia replied, checking her radio and adjusting the volume. "But Daniel, we have to be careful. This isn't just about photographs anymore. Tully's shown he's willing to escalate things." The seriousness in her voice matched the gravity settling over them both. Daniel touched the note in his pocket, its edges now worn from his nervous fidgeting. The paper felt like it was burning through his jacket, a constant reminder of the danger ahead. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. They'd crossed a line, and the only way now was forward. The forest trail wound through ancient pines, their branches filtering the midday sun into dancing patterns on the ground. Daniel adjusted his camera strap as he walked beside Sophia, both moving with careful steps. "Tully's been at this for years," Sophia explained, her voice low and steady. "Every time we find his traps, he's already moved on to a new spot." She paused to examine a broken twig. "The worst part is what it's doing to the forest. These animals are all connected. Remove too many predators and suddenly the whole system falls apart." Daniel nodded, his camera ready. 20 yards behind them, a flash of movement caught his eye, the Bobcat following silently through the underbrush. Her presence was both reassuring and unsettling. As they reached a rocky overlook, Sophia dropped to one knee, pointing at fresh tracks in the soft earth. "Look here, these are recent, maybe hours old." The ravine below stretched out like a green carpet, dense with vegetation. Daniel crouched beside her, photographing the footprints while Sophia jotted notes in her small notebook. The air felt thick with tension, every rustle of leaves making them pause and listen. A sharp cry pierced the silence, causing them both to freeze. The bobcat emerged from the shadows, her golden eyes fixed on them. She turned her head uphill, then back to them, her meaning clear. "She wants us to follow," Daniel whispered, already rising to his feet. They followed the bobcat through a thicket so dense they had to push branches aside to pass. Another cry, weaker this time, guided them forward. The bobcat moved with purpose, leading them to a clearing where a metal snare lay unset on the ground. "It's fresh," Sophia said, examining the wire. "He's been here today." The crying grew louder, and the bobcat padded toward the sound, looking back occasionally to ensure they followed. Her trust in them was evident now, a stark contrast to their first encounter in the forest. Daniel and Sophia exchanged glances, both knowing they needed to press on. The bobcat waited ahead, her tail twitching with urgency, as another weak cry echoed through the trees. The stench hit them first. Daniel's stomach lurched as they pushed through the thick undergrowth, following the bobcat's lead. What they found made him wish he hadn't had breakfast. Animal remains littered the ground beneath the trees. Bones, fur, and worse things scattered across the forest floor told a story of systematic cruelty. Unset snares hung from low branches like terrible decorations. "This is worse than I imagined," Daniel whispered, his camera hanging forgotten at his side. Sophia moved methodically through the site, her face pale but determined as she photographed each piece of evidence. Her hands shook slightly as she documented a particularly brutal trap. "All these animals," she said, her voice cracking. "I should have caught him years ago. I knew he was out here, but I could never—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. The bobcat watched from the edge of the clearing, her golden eyes reflecting their shared pain. Daniel stepped closer to Sophia, careful not to disturb any evidence. "This isn't your fault. You did everything you could with what you had." "Did I?" Sophia's voice was bitter. "Look at this. How many animals suffered while I filed reports and waited for backup that never came?" She gestured at the grim scene around them. "You're here now," Daniel said firmly. "We both are, and we're going to stop him." They worked in silence for several minutes, documenting everything. The bobcat's presence kept them focused, reminding them of what they were fighting for. When they couldn't stand the sight anymore, they made their way to a nearby creek. The sound of running water offered some relief from the horror they'd witnessed. They knelt by the creek, washing their hands in the cool water. "Thank you," Sophia said quietly, watching the water flow past. "For helping, for caring." Daniel looked up at her. "Of course. How could I not?" The bobcat settled on a rock upstream, grooming her injured paw. Her calm presence seemed to say that even in the darkest moments, hope remained. Sophia dried her hands on her uniform. "Ready to keep going?" Daniel nodded, standing up. They had more ground to cover, more evidence to gather. The weight of what they'd seen pressed heavy on their shoulders, but their shared purpose made it easier to bear. Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead as he and Sophia emerged from the forest onto the dusty roadside clearing. His muscles ached from hours of documenting Tully's cruel handiwork. A silver sedan pulled up, gravel crunching under its tires. His heart skipped a beat as his sister Jane stepped out. She looked older than he remembered, her dark hair streaked with early gray. Their eyes met, and the weight of unspoken words hung between them. "Hey," Daniel said softly. "Hey yourself." Jane's voice was careful, measured. "Got your messages. Sounded important." They made their way to May's Cafe, a local spot humming with afternoon chatter. The bell chimed as they entered, and the smell of coffee wrapped around them. They slid into a worn booth, Jane pulling a thick folder from her bag. "Found these in Dad's old office," she said, spreading out yellowed maps and property documents. "Our land borders the state forest here." Her finger traced a line. "Dad always talked about keeping it wild, remember? For the animals." Daniel leaned forward, studying the boundaries. "These traps we found, they're all along this corridor." Sophia's eyes widened as she examined the maps. "The wildlife uses this route to move between protected areas. If someone wanted to buy the land cheap, they could drive away the wildlife first," Jane finished, her professional real estate knowledge clicking into place. "Make it seem worthless for conservation." At the ranger outpost, Sophia pinned the maps to her bulletin board. Red markers showed each trap location, forming a deliberate pattern along the property line. "Tully's not just poaching," Daniel said, the pieces falling into place. "He's trying to destroy the land's value, make it easier to grab." Jane nodded, her earlier coldness softening as they worked together. "These parcels would be worth a fortune to the right developer. If the wildlife corridor gets broken..." "We need proof," Sophia said firmly, her ranger training kicking in. "Something concrete linking Tully to both the traps and any land deals." They gathered around Sophia's desk, three unlikely allies united by a common cause. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, highlighting the determination on their faces as they began to plan their next move. Daniel and Jane walked side by side down the empty main street, their footsteps echoing off weathered storefronts. The morning sun cast long shadows, but the warmth did nothing to thaw the chill between them. "You just left, Daniel," Jane burst out, her voice cracking. "After Mom and Dad died, you packed up your camera and disappeared. I had to handle everything alone. The funeral, the estate, all of it." Daniel stopped walking, his shoulders slumping. "I couldn't face it, Jane. Every room in that house, every photo on the wall, it hurt too much." "And you think it didn't hurt me?" Jane's eyes glistened. "I needed my big brother." "I'm sorry," Daniel said softly. "I was lost. Photography wasn't just an escape. It was the only way I could feel close to Dad. Remember how he taught me to use his old camera?" Jane's expression softened slightly at the memory. They walked in silence until reaching Morton's Hardware, its faded red sign creaking in the breeze. Inside, Jane pulled supplies from a shopping bag: motion-activated cameras, mounting brackets, and camouflage tape. "I figured we could use these to catch Tully in the act," she explained, her voice businesslike but less cold. "I know the layout of Mom and Dad's old property better than anyone." Daniel picked up one of the cameras, turning it over in his hands. "This is perfect, Jane. Thank you." "I'm not doing it for you," she said, but there was less bite in her words. "I'm doing it because it's right." Back at the ranger station, Sophia spread out a topographical map, while Daniel and Jane arranged the surveillance gear on her desk. "If we position cameras here, here, and here," Sophia pointed to key locations, "we should catch any suspicious activity. But we'll need to be careful. Tully's dangerous when cornered." Jane nodded firmly. "We'll work in teams. No one goes alone." "Agreed," Daniel said, meeting his sister's eyes. For the first time in years, they shared a moment of perfect understanding. Sophia gathered the equipment into her pack. "Let's head out at first light tomorrow. We'll need all day to set these up properly." The evening sun painted long shadows across the forest's edge as Daniel, Jane, and Sophia unpacked their gear. Daniel checked the battery levels on the wildlife cameras, while Sophia marked locations on her map. Jane sorted through mounting brackets and camouflage tape, her movements precise and methodical. "These need to be perfectly hidden," Sophia explained, pointing to potential mounting spots. "If Tully spots them, we'll lose our chance." A rustle in the undergrowth drew their attention. The Bobcat emerged from the tree line, her golden eyes watchful. Daniel paused, camera in hand, and smiled softly. "She's been keeping tabs on us," he whispered to Jane, who stared in wonder at the wild cat. They moved deeper into the woods, finding a hollow tree trunk near an overgrown trail. Sophia knelt down, pointing to fresh marks in the soil. "Another snare site," she said grimly, carefully documenting the location. Jane's face paled as she examined the cruel device. How could anyone do this to innocent animals? Daniel placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's why we're here. We'll stop him." "Documentation is key," Sophia added, photographing the snare from multiple angles. "We need solid evidence for the prosecution to stick. Every detail matters." As dusk approached, they finished setting up their final camera in a peaceful clearing. The Bobcat, who had been following at a distance, suddenly approached closer than ever before. She turned her head, looking deeper into the forest, then back at the group. "I think she wants us to follow," Daniel said softly. They trailed behind the Bobcat, moving carefully through the deepening shadows until they reached a sheltered den. Inside, the cubs rested peacefully, their wounds healing. One lifted its head and mewed softly at their mother. Daniel crouched down, his camera forgotten at his side, eyes misting as he watched the family. Jane studied her brother's face, seeing the depth of his compassion for the first time since their reunion. "You really care about them, don't you?" she asked quietly. "Every creature deserves protection," Daniel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like every family deserves a chance to heal." The meaning behind his words wasn't lost on Jane, who found herself seeing her brother in a new light as they watched the Bobcat family together. In the quiet darkness of the ranger outpost, three faces glowed blue in the light of multiple monitors. Daniel, Jane, and Sophia huddled around the screens, watching the nighttime forest through their hidden cameras. The soft hum of equipment filled the room as they scanned different camera feeds. "Wait, there!" Sophia's finger jabbed at one screen. A shadowy figure moved through the frame, carrying what looked like coiled wire. Daniel leaned closer. "That's Tully." His voice was tight with anger as they watched the man methodically setting a snare. The camera's angle caught half of his weathered face in sharp detail as he worked, his movements practiced and efficient. "We've got him," Jane whispered, gripping her brother's arm. "Clear as day." Sophia immediately reached for her radio, her expression grim. "Base, this is Martinez. We have confirmation of illegal trapping activity, requesting immediate backup." Static crackled, followed by a tired voice explaining that the nearest available units were hours away. "So what do we do?" Jane asked, pacing the small room. "We can't let him keep hurting animals while we wait." Sophia ran her fingers through her hair in frustration. "Without backup, confronting him directly would be dangerous. He knows these woods better than anyone." Later that night, Daniel and Jane stood on his motel balcony, the stars twinkling overhead. The forest stretched before them, dark and mysterious. "Remember how Dad used to take us camping out there?" Jane's voice was soft with memory. "He taught us every constellation." Daniel nodded, throat tight. "I'm sorry I stopped coming home after everything. I just couldn't face it." Jane turned to him, moonlight catching the tears in her eyes. "I understand now. I was angry for so long, but seeing you here, fighting for something important, it reminds me of who you've always been." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "I forgive you, Danny." The childhood nickname broke something loose in Daniel's chest, and he pulled his sister into a tight hug. They stood there under the stars, the weight of years of distance finally lifting from their shoulders. The morning sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy as Daniel, Jane, and Sophia crept along the narrow forest trail. Their footsteps were muffled by years of fallen pine needles, each step careful and deliberate. Behind them, The bobcat's presence was marked only by occasional rustles in the underbrush, her golden eyes watchful. "This way," Sophia whispered, pointing to fresh boot prints in a patch of mud. "He's been here recently." Daniel gripped his camera tighter, his knuckles white. Jane stayed close to her brother, her breathing shallow but controlled. They found a thick cluster of bushes near one of Tully's known trap sites and settled in to wait. The minutes crawled by like hours until a twig snapped nearby. Marcus Tully emerged from between the trees, his movements purposeful as he checked his snares. He carried a leather bag that clinked with metal tools as he walked. Sophia raised her camera, the quiet click of the shutter lost in the forest sounds. Through his own lens, Daniel captured every damning detail. Tully adjusting wire tensions, checking anchor points, setting deadly mechanisms with practiced ease. Jane's fingers wrapped around a fallen branch, her grip tight enough to whiten her knuckles. She watched Tully work, disgust and fear battling across her face. The peaceful morning shattered when Tully suddenly stiffened, his head snapping toward their hiding spot. In one fluid motion, he dropped his bag and pulled a rifle from his shoulder. "I told you to stay out of these woods," he bellowed, leveling the weapon at them. Daniel stepped forward, hands raised. "Put the gun down, Mr. Tully. We just want to talk." "This is private property." Tully's finger curled around the trigger. Sophia emerged, her ranger badge gleaming. "Marcus Tully, you're under arrest. Lower your weapon." Jane stood shakily, still clutching her branch. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Don't make this worse." Tully's eyes darted between them, wild and dangerous. The rifle barrel swept from one target to another as sweat beaded on his forehead. "Last chance," he snarled, the rifle settling on Daniel's chest. "Get out now, or nobody leaves." Tully's rifle glinted in the filtered sunlight as he leveled it at the group. His weathered face twisted with anger. "You're trespassing on my land," he snarled. "I've got every right to protect what's mine." Sophia stepped forward, her stance firm, despite the weapon aimed at her chest. "This is protected forest land, Mr. Tully. We have documented evidence of your illegal traps and poaching activities. Put the rifle down." "Evidence?" Tully spat. "You've got nothing." Daniel held up his camera. "Everything's recorded. The snares, the injured animals, all of it." With a roar of rage, Tully lunged forward, knocking into Daniel. The camera went flying as both men tumbled to the ground. The rifle clattered away in the chaos. Jane rushed forward, grabbing her brother's jacket, trying to pull him free from Tully's grasp. "Daniel!" she screamed, tugging with all her strength. Sophia dove for the fallen rifle while Tully and Daniel wrestled in the dirt. Tully's canvas bag toppled over, spilling its contents, steel wire snares, bloody tools, and tags from trapped animals scattered across the forest floor. The struggle intensified, with Tully's elbow catching Daniel in the ribs. Jane stumbled backward, still clutching Daniel's jacket. The sound of their scuffle echoed through the trees. A low, menacing growl cut through the chaos. The bobcat emerged from the shadows, her golden eyes fixed on Tully, teeth bared in a fierce snarl. She stood between the struggling men and her den, fur bristling, every muscle tense. Tully froze, his eyes widening at the sight of the wild cat. His moment of shock was all Daniel needed to wrench free, scrambling away from the poacher's grasp. Sophia raised the rifle, keeping it trained on Tully. "Don't move," she commanded. Jane snatched up Tully's fallen bag, gathering the scattered evidence. The bobcat maintained her protective stance, her growl a constant warning that held Tully motionless on the ground. Daniel got to his feet, breathing hard, his clothes covered in dirt. He retrieved his camera, checking that it was still working. "We've got everything we need," he said, voice rough but triumphant. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he bound Tully's wrists with the poacher's own rope. Tully thrashed and cursed, his face red with fury. "You're making a big mistake," he growled. "The only mistake was thinking you could get away with this," Sophia said firmly, keeping the rifle trained on him. Her stance was unwavering, professional. "We have everything on camera, the snares, the injured animals, you setting the traps. It's over." Jane moved carefully around them, gathering the scattered evidence. Her fingers shook as she picked up bloody wire snares and tools, placing them methodically into an evidence bag. Each item told its own horrible story of cruelty. "Good work, Jane," Daniel said softly, seeing his sister's determination despite her fear. They moved Tully to a small clearing nearby where they could better watch him while waiting for backup. The afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. Sophia kept one eye on their prisoner while speaking into her radio. "This is Ranger Martinez. Suspect in custody at coordinates 4427. Multiple pieces of evidence secured, requesting immediate backup." Daniel pulled out his tablet with slightly shaking hands, reviewing the footage from their hidden cameras. The images were crystal clear, Tully's face visible as he set his cruel traps. "We've got him," he said quietly. "It's all here." Jane stood watch over Tully, her earlier fear replaced by quiet strength. She'd found her courage in this forest, standing alongside her brother. Tully glared at her, but she didn't flinch. A movement caught Daniel's eye. The Bobcat emerged from the undergrowth, her steps silent and graceful. She approached him slowly, golden eyes fixed on his face. Daniel knelt, extending his hand palm up in a gesture of thanks. The Bobcat paused, regarding him with an almost human understanding. Then, as quietly as she'd appeared, she melted back into the shadows, heading home to her cubs. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing closer. Help was finally coming. The ranger station hummed with activity as two junior rangers escorted a sullen Tully toward their vehicle. His shoulders slumped in defeat, though his eyes still burned with anger. Sophia watched carefully, her hand resting on her belt as they secured him in the back seat. Inside the outpost, Daniel spread their evidence across a wooden table. Jane organized the photos while Sophia typed up her official report, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. The hidden camera footage played on a nearby monitor, clearly showing Tully's crimes. "This is remarkable documentation," said Officer Thompson, a local authority who had arrived to review the case. He picked up one of Daniel's photographs showing Tully setting a snare. "The timestamp and image quality. It's perfect for prosecution." "The GPS coordinates are logged for each trap location," Sophia added, pointing to her detailed map. "And we have physical evidence to match each site." Jane held up the bag of collected snares. "These still have traces of blood and fur on them. Will that help?" "Absolutely," Thompson nodded. "This is one of the most well-documented cases I've seen. You've done excellent work here." Later, on the outpost's wooden porch, Daniel leaned against the railing beside Jane. The afternoon sun warmed their faces as they watched Tully's transport vehicle disappear down the dirt road. "I can't believe we actually did it," Jane said softly, a small smile playing at her lips. Daniel turned to his sister. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" "Yeah," she agreed, bumping his shoulder with hers. "We do." Sophia joined them, removing her ranger hat and running a hand through her hair. "I want to thank you both," she said. "What you did today, following your instincts, helping gather evidence, standing up to Tully, it took real courage." Daniel shook his head. "We couldn't have done it without you, Sophia. Your experience and leadership made all the difference." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the forest beyond the station. The day's events had forged something special between them, a bond of shared purpose and triumph over wrongdoing. The town hall buzzed with excited chatter as people filled the wooden benches. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patches across the worn floor. Mayor Thompson, a silver-haired man with kind eyes, stood at the podium and raised his hands for quiet. "Thanks to these 3 brave individuals," he said, gesturing to Daniel, Jane, and Sophia, "our forest is safer today. Marcus Tully's reign of terror is finally over." Applause filled the room. An elderly woman stood up, her voice trembling. "My cat went missing last month. I always feared it was one of those awful traps." Others nodded, sharing similar worries about their pets and local wildlife. Later, at Pete's Cafe, Daniel and Jane sat across from each other in a cozy booth. Steam rose from their coffee cups as sunlight painted patterns on the checkered tablecloth. "Remember how Dad used to take us hiking every Sunday?" Jane asked, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "He knew every trail, every tree." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. "Mom would pack those enormous sandwiches, said we needed the energy for adventure." Jane reached into her bag and pulled out a worn folder. "I found these while cleaning out the attic." She spread several yellowed documents across the table. "It's their will and some letters. They wanted the land to stay wild, a haven for the animals." Daniel's eyes scanned the papers, his heart swelling with pride and purpose. They knew how special this place was. The bell above the cafe door chimed as Sophia entered, her ranger uniform neat despite the long day. She joined them, sliding into the booth with an energetic smile. "You know what we need," she said, leaning forward. "A community wildlife workshop. We could teach people about the forest, help them understand why it needs protecting." Daniel and Jane exchanged glances, their smiles growing wider. The idea felt right. A perfect way to honor their parents' wishes and protect the place they all loved. Through the cafe window, the forest stretched toward the horizon, its green expanse peaceful in the fading light. The morning sun painted golden streaks through the trees as Daniel walked the familiar forest path. His camera hung comfortably around his neck, a welcome weight that reminded him of his purpose. The air felt different now, cleaner, safer. No more hidden dangers lurked beneath the fallen leaves or behind weathered logs. He paused to photograph a patch of wildflowers, their delicate petals swaying in the gentle breeze. The forest seemed to breathe easier, as if it too knew that Tully's traps were gone. Birds called overhead, their songs more vibrant than before. In a quiet grove, sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. There, in the clearing ahead, the bobcat emerged from the shadows. Her limp was barely noticeable now, and her golden eyes shone with renewed strength. Behind her, 2 cubs tumbled and played, their movements carefree and energetic. Daniel raised his camera with trembling hands. Through the lens, he watched as one cub pounced on a falling leaf while the other stalked its sibling's tail. The mother bobcat sat regally, watching her young ones with patient eyes. The scene before him blurred slightly as tears welled up, but Daniel kept shooting, capturing frame after frame of this precious moment. The smaller cub, the one that had been trapped, showed no signs of fear or pain now. It bounded through the grass, playfully wrestling with its sibling. Their mother's watchful gaze occasionally turned to Daniel, but there was no hostility in her eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement. As he took the final photo, Daniel lowered his camera and simply watched. The morning light caught the bobcat's fur, giving her an almost ethereal glow. In this peaceful moment, he felt the weight of everything they'd accomplished. The forest was healing. Its creatures were safe. And somehow, in protecting this place and these magnificent animals, Daniel had found his own healing too. A smile spread across his face as he watched the family play in their restored sanctuary. His camera had captured not just images, but hope itself, the kind that bloomed in the aftermath of darkness, as resilient as the creatures who called this forest home. The Ranger Outpost conference room buzzed with energy as Daniel and Sophia spread maps across the worn wooden table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating colorful wildlife guides and educational materials. "We could set up viewing stations," Daniel said, pointing to several clearings on the map. "Safe spots where families can watch wildlife without disturbing them." Sophia nodded, making notes in her weathered notebook. "That's perfect. Your photography experience would be invaluable for teaching people how to observe and document wildlife responsibly." The door swung open, and Jane hurried in, her arms full of freshly printed brochures. Her eyes sparkled with excitement as she laid them out on the table. "I couldn't sleep last night," she explained, smoothing the papers. "So I designed these. Look, they show the local wildlife and explain why protecting their habitat matters." Daniel picked up a brochure, touched by his sister's dedication. The cover featured one of his photographs of the bobcat and her cubs, now healthy and thriving. "These are amazing, Jane," Sophia said, examining the detailed information inside. "We could distribute them at schools, libraries, everywhere in town." They gathered around the table, their enthusiasm growing as they planned workshops and nature walks. Sophia pulled out a calendar marking potential dates for educational events. "The school children will love this," Jane said, sketching out ideas for interactive activities. "We could teach them about tracking, animal behavior, everything we've learned." Sophia looked at them both with appreciation. "You know, we each bring something special to this. Daniel, your patience and empathy with wildlife. Jane, your creativity and organizational skills. Together, we can make a real difference." The morning light shifted across the room as they refined their plans. When everything was settled, they stepped outside into the crisp air. The forest stretched before them, a living reminder of what they fought to protect. "Partners?" Sophia extended her hand. Daniel and Jane reached out, their hands joining in a firm handshake. The gesture felt right, a promise to keep fighting for the forest and its inhabitants, to ensure no one forgot the lessons learned from Tully's actions. The small-town art gallery hummed with excited voices as visitors gathered around Daniel's photographs. Large, stunning images of the Bobcat family lined the walls, each telling a part of their journey. The mother Bobcat's fierce golden eyes seemed to follow viewers as they moved from picture to picture, while shots of her playing cubs brought smiles to people's faces. "Look at how she's protecting them," whispered a young girl, pointing to a photo of the mother bobcat standing guard over her den. Daniel watched as people read the captions beneath each image, explaining the story of the poacher's traps and the community's effort to protect the forest. Several visitors wiped away tears, while others nodded with determination. In a quiet corner of the gallery, Jane pulled Daniel aside. She unfolded a worn piece of paper from her bag, their parents' old property map. "Mom and Dad always wanted the land preserved," Jane said softly, smoothing the creased paper. "The cabin's just sitting there empty. Why don't you rent it from me? You could continue your wildlife photography, maybe even start those education programs we talked about." Daniel traced the property lines with his finger, memories of childhood adventures flooding back. "You'd really be okay with that?" "More than okay," Jane smiled. "It's what they would have wanted." As the evening wound down, Daniel and Jane stepped outside onto the gallery steps. The warm evening air carried the scent of pine from the nearby forest. Sophia joined them, still wearing her ranger uniform. "These photos are incredible," Sophia said, giving Daniel's shoulder a squeeze. "People really understand now why protecting the forest matters." We make a pretty good team, Jane added, looking between them. The best, Sophia agreed. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning of our work together. Daniel looked at these two women who had become such important parts of his life. His sister, finally close again, and the dedicated ranger who had helped them protect what mattered most. Together, they gazed toward the forest, their shared purpose stronger than ever. Daniel stood at the forest's edge, his camera hanging loose at his side. Golden afternoon light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the spot where, just weeks ago, he'd first heard that desperate cry for help. The memory felt both distant and crystal clear. The injured bobcat limping into view, her eyes meeting his with an uncanny intelligence. He breathed in the forest air, rich with the scent of pine and earth. This place had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. What started as a simple wildlife photography trip had led to healing old wounds with Jane, forming new friendships, and protecting the creatures who called these woods home. A gentle breeze rustled the underbrush, carrying the whispers of leaves. Daniel's eyes scanned the tree line, hoping for one last glimpse of the remarkable animal who had trusted him when she needed help most. The minutes ticked by in peaceful silence. Then, like a ghost materializing from the shadows, the bobcat appeared. She stood about 30 yards away, her tawny coat catching the late afternoon light. Her movements were smooth now, showing no trace of her earlier injury. She paused at the edge of the thicker forest, her golden eyes finding Daniel's. In that moment of connection, Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. This wild creature had not only trusted him, but had helped him find his way back to what mattered most: family, purpose, and the quiet beauty of the natural world. The bobcat held his gaze for a few heartbeats more, her tail swaying gently. Then, with the same grace she'd always shown, she turned and melted into the forest's embrace, disappearing among the shadows and leaves. Daniel smiled softly, his heart full. The weight he'd carried when he first arrived in this small town had lifted, replaced by something lighter, something that felt a lot like peace. With one last look at the spot where the bobcat had vanished, he turned back toward town, his footsteps sure and steady on the familiar path. The evening sun cast long shadows across Jane's cabin driveway as Daniel loaded the last of his camera equipment into his car. The forest loomed behind them, a silent witness to their newfound connection. Jane emerged from the cabin, clutching a carefully wrapped package to her chest. "Before you go," she said, her voice soft with emotion, "I want you to have this." She handed him the package, watching as he gently unwrapped it. Daniel's breath caught as he revealed a framed photograph, himself and Jane as children, flanked by their smiling parents against the backdrop of these same woods. His fingers traced the wooden frame, memories flooding back. "Mom and Dad would be proud," Jane said, clearing her throat, "of what we did here, protecting the forest they loved so much." Daniel nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I was so wrong to stay away," he finally managed. "All this time I thought I was running from the pain, but I was really running from who I needed to be." They moved to the cabin porch, where the setting sun painted the forest in shades of amber and gold. Jane reached out and pulled Daniel into a tight embrace, tears spilling onto his shoulder. "Promise you'll stay in touch this time," she whispered fiercely. "No more disappearing acts." "I promise," Daniel replied, his own eyes wet. "We'll protect this place together, just like Mom and Dad would have wanted." As they separated, Jane wiped her eyes. "I'll start the paperwork next week to ensure the land stays protected. Maybe we can turn part of it into a wildlife sanctuary." Daniel squeezed her hand one last time before walking to his car. He placed the framed photo carefully on the passenger seat, a tangible reminder of everything he'd gained these past weeks. As he drove away, the forest filled his rearview mirror, no longer a place of painful memories, but a symbol of healing and hope. The winding road carried him forward, but this time, he knew he wasn't leaving everything behind. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.